The Arizona desert stretched out, an endless canvas of ochre and burnt umber under the relentless gaze of the midday sun. Dr. Emily Carter, her brow furrowed with concentration, surveyed the excavation site. Years of meticulous work had led her team to this remote, desolate region, drawn by whispers of a forgotten tomb hidden beneath the sands. A seasoned archaeologist, Emily held little stock in local folklore, dismissing tales of ancient curses as mere superstition. Her focus was on tangible history, on the artifacts that whispered stories of civilizations long past. "Anything, Zav?" she called out to her assistant, Xavier Williams, a young man whose enthusiasm often outpaced his caution. "Just loose sand and the usual desert debris, Dr. Carter," Zav replied, his voice muffled by the bandana covering his face. "But I think I've hit something solid here." Emily approached, her eyes narrowing as she watched Zav carefully brush away the layers of sand and sediment. Beneath the grime, a dark, intricate object began to emerge. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. A collection of bones, intricately woven together, forming a grotesque yet strangely beautiful artifact. "What is it?" Ben Michaels, Emily's colleague, asked, his voice laced with a hint of unease. "I'm not sure," Emily admitted, her fingers tracing the strange, cold surface of the object. "It looks organic, yet deliberately crafted." The artifact was a tangled mass of bone, bound together with some unknown dark material. Strange, indecipherable symbols were etched into the surface of each bone, giving the object an aura of unsettling antiquity. A palpable sense of unease settled over the excavation site, a feeling that even Emily, the staunch skeptic, couldn't entirely dismiss. "It's disturbing," Ben murmured, his eyes fixed on the artifact. "There's something about it that just feels wrong." "Nonsense," Emily retorted, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "It's simply an artifact from a culture we don't yet understand. We'll take it back to the lab for analysis." With careful hands, the team extracted the artifact from the tomb and secured it for transport. As they made their way back to the University of Arizona, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had unearthed something far more significant than a mere historical relic. Back in the sterile, brightly lit confines of the university's research lab, the artifact was placed on a stainless steel table, its dark form stark against the clean, clinical environment. Emily, Ben, and Zav gathered around it, their eyes fixed on the strange object. "The bone structure is unusual," Emily observed, peering through a magnifying glass. "I've never seen anything like it, and these symbols, they don't match any known language." As they began their initial analysis, a strange phenomenon occurred. The temperature in the lab seemed to drop suddenly, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the air. Zav, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, pointed to the artifact. "Look," he whispered, it's glowing." A faint, ethereal light emanated from the artifact, casting eerie shadows across the lab. The humming intensified, growing into a low, resonant drone that vibrated through the floor. Emily, despite her skepticism, felt a shiver crawl down her spine. There was no denying it. Something strange, something inexplicable was happening. The faint, ethereal glow from the artifact pulsed rhythmically, casting long, distorted shadows across the lab. Emily, despite her scientific training, couldn't shake the feeling that they had awakened something ancient and malevolent. "We need to run some tests," she said, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "Spectrographic analysis, carbon dating, everything we can think of." Hours turned into a blur as the team worked, their efforts focused on understanding the nature of the strange artifact. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the lab grew increasingly tense. The humming from the artifact intensified, becoming a low, resonant drone that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. That night, Emily's dreams were plagued by vivid, nightmarish visions. She found herself trapped in a dark, labyrinthine realm, pursued by a monstrous creature with eyes that burned like embers. The creature was a grotesque amalgamation of bone and shadow, its form shifting and contorting in the darkness. She awoke. With a start, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. "Just a dream," she muttered, trying to reassure herself. But the image of the creature, its malevolent eyes boring into her soul, lingered in her mind. The next morning, Emily arrived at the lab to find Ben hunched over a stack of ancient texts, his brow furrowed with concern. "I found something," he said, his voice low and grave. "Legends, old stories. They speak of a creature, a powerful entity imprisoned in an object of bone. They say it was sealed away by a powerful ritual to prevent it from unleashing its dark power upon the world." "Superstition," Emily scoffed, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Maybe," Ben conceded, "but these stories, they're consistent. They all describe a creature that matches what we saw in your dream, Emily, and they all warn of the dangers of disturbing its prison." Zav, his face pale, approached them, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "I've been hearing of things," he whispered. "Strange noises, whispers. I think it's coming from the artifact." Emily tried to dismiss their fears, to cling to the logic of science, but the growing unease in the lab, the strange occurrences, the vivid nightmares, they were beginning to erode her skepticism. As they worked, a new phenomenon began to manifest. The lights in the lab flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows across the walls. A cold, palpable dread settled over the room, as if an unseen presence were watching them. "We need to be careful," Ben said, his voice tight with apprehension. "We don't know what we've unleashed." Later that evening, while reviewing some high-resolution photos of the bone structure, Zav pointed out very minute details that had been missed before. There were very fine cracks appearing along some of the bones, and some of the etched symbols appeared to have shifted slightly. "It's changing," Zav said, his voice barely a whisper. The revelation that the artifact was changing added another layer of dread to the already tense atmosphere in the lab. Emily, despite her growing unease, still clung to a semblance of scientific rationale. "It could be a reaction to the environment," she suggested, her voice slightly strained. "Changes in temperature, humidity. Or it could be waking up," Ben countered, his eyes fixed on the artifact. "The stories say it was imprisoned, not destroyed. What if it's regaining its strength?" Emily dismissed the idea, but the nightmares continued, growing more vivid and disturbing with each passing night. The creature in her dreams was becoming more defined, its features more distinct, its presence more menacing. She could feel its hot, fetid breath on her skin, hear its guttural growls echoing in her ears. During the day, the line between her dreams and reality began to blur. She would catch glimpses of the creature in the periphery of her vision, its shadowy form lurking in the corners of the lab. At first, she dismissed them as tricks of the light, fatigue-induced hallucinations, but the sightings became more frequent, more tangible, until she could no longer deny what she was seeing. One afternoon, while examining the artifact under a high-powered microscope, Emily felt a cold, clammy hand brush against her arm. She recoiled, her heart pounding, her eyes darting around the lab, but she was alone. "It's in my head," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's trying to drive me insane." Ben, noticing Emily's distress, tried to reassure her. "It's the stress, Emily. We're all under a lot of pressure." "No," she insisted, her eyes wide with fear. "It's real. I can feel it." Zav, meanwhile, was experiencing his own share of horrors. Since touching the artifact, he had been plagued by visions of the creature's past, its agonizing imprisonment, He saw flashes of a dark, ritualistic ceremony, of robed figures chanting in an unknown language, of the creature's desperate struggle against its captors. These visions weren't just images in his mind. They felt like memories, as if he had lived through the creature's suffering. He could feel its pain, its rage, its burning desire for revenge. One evening, Zav approached Emily and Ben, his face pale and drawn. "I saw how it was trapped," he said, his voice hoarse. "They used its own bones against it, bound it with its own essence. That's why the artifact is changing. It's trying to break free." He also began to pick up on the same whispers he heard at night, during the day. However, now he could almost make out what was being said. He didn't want to tell Emily or Ben yet, until he was sure, but he thought the whispers were in English, and they were saying his name. Zav's words hung in the air, heavy with dread. The idea that the artifact was not merely a vessel, but a cage, a prison built of the creature's own essence, sent a chill through Emily. She looked at the artifact, its dark form pulsating with an eerie light, and felt a surge of fear she had never experienced before. "We need to get rid of it," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to destroy it." "We don't know what will happen if we do that," Ben cautioned. "We could be unleashing something far worse." "And what if we do nothing?" Emily retorted. "What if it breaks free on its own? We've seen what it can do. It's already driving me insane." As if to punctuate her words, a wave of cold swept through the lab, causing the lights to flicker and die. In the darkness, the artifact's glow intensified, casting grotesque shadows across the room. "It's here," Zav whispered, his voice hoarse with terror. The air crackled with unseen energy, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the lab. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she strained to see through the darkness. Then a form began to materialize in the center of the room, a grotesque silhouette of bone and shadow. The creature was a nightmare made flesh. Its form shifted and contorted, its limbs elongated and twisted, its eyes glowing with malevolent intensity. It let out a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the lab. Emily screamed, her voice lost in the creature's deafening cry. She stumbled backward, her eyes fixed on the monstrous form before her. It lunged at her, its bony claws reaching out to tear her apart. She felt a sharp, searing pain as the creature's claws grazed her arm, leaving deep, bloody gashes. She cried out, her voice a mix of pain and terror. Zav, his face pale with fear, grabbed a heavy metal tool and charged at the creature, striking it with all his might. The creature recoiled, its attention momentarily diverted. Ben and Professor Davies, hearing the commotion, rushed into the lab, their faces etched with horror. They saw the creature, its form now fully manifested, its eyes burning with hatred. "We have to contain it," Professor Davies shouted, his voice trembling. "We have to find a way to send it back." The team scrambled to find anything that could be used as a weapon, anything that could help them fight back against the creature. But the creature was too powerful, too relentless. It moved with unnatural speed, its attacks swift and brutal. Emily, despite her fear, found a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She knew they couldn't run, they couldn't hide, they had to fight. "Zav was right," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's trapped in its own essence. We have to use that against it." She grabbed a broken piece of the artifact, its jagged edges sharp and dangerous. "We have to break the connection," she said. "We have to destroy the artifact." The creature, sensing their intent, let out a deafening roar and charged at them, its eyes burning with fury. The fight had begun. The creature lunged, a whirlwind of bone and shadow, its roar echoing through the shattered lab. Emily, fueled by a mix of fear and desperation, dodged its attack, the broken shard of the artifact clutched tightly in her hand. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the crackling energy of the creature's malevolence. "Ben! The ritual!" Professor Davies yelled, his voice strained. "We need to start the ritual now." Ben, his face pale but resolute, nodded. He had managed to salvage some of the ancient texts from his earlier research, and with Professor Davis's guidance, they began to recite the incantations, their voices a trembling counterpoint to the creature's guttural growls. Zav, his eyes fixed on the creature's movements, noticed a pattern in its attacks. It seemed to be drawn to the artifact, as if it were tethered to it. "It's connected to the artifact," he shouted. "That's how we weaken it." Emily, seizing the opportunity, lunged at the creature, the sharp edge of the artifact shard aimed at its chest. The creature roared in pain as the shard pierced its bony flesh, a dark, viscous fluid oozing from the wound. It turned its attention to Emily, its eyes burning with hatred. "Emily, no!" Ben cried out, his voice filled with alarm. But Emily was relentless. She knew that this was their only chance. She pressed the attack, using the artifact shard to inflict more wounds on the creature, each strike weakening its hold on this reality. The creature thrashed and roared, its form flickering and contorting, its power waning. Zav, remembering the visions he had seen, knew where the creature's essence was concentrated. "Its core, in its chest," he yelled, pointing at the creature's bony chest. Emily, her hands trembling, aimed the artifact shard at the creature's core, the place Zav indicated. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she plunged the shard deep into the creature's chest. A blinding flash of light erupted from the creature's form, followed by a deafening roar that shook the entire lab. The creature's form began to dissolve, its bones crumbling to dust, its shadow fading into nothingness. The artifact, glowing brightly, pulsed with energy, then shattered into 1,000 pieces. The lab fell silent. The only sound, the ragged breathing of the survivors. Emily, her body shaking, her hands covered in the creature's dark fluid, looked at the remnants of the shattered artifact. The threat was gone, for now. Ben and Professor Davies, their voices hoarse, completed the ritual, their words sealing the remnants of the creature's essence, preventing it from ever returning. Zav collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but relieved. They were alive, they had faced the darkness and survived, but the experience had changed them, had shattered their perceptions of the world. They knew that the darkness they had faced was just a glimpse of the horrors that lurked beyond the veil of the known. The aftermath of the confrontation left the lab in ruins. Shattered glass, overturned equipment, and the faint, lingering scent of ozone filled the air. But amidst the chaos, a sense of quiet relief settled over the survivors. They had faced a terror beyond their wildest nightmares, and they had emerged victorious. Emily, her hands still shaking, examined the wounds on her arm. The creature's dark fluid had left deep, festering gashes, a constant reminder of the horror she had faced. She looked at the remnants of the shattered artifact, now nothing more than dust and fragments of bone. "It's gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's finally gone." But even as she spoke, a seed of doubt began to sprout in her mind. Had they truly destroyed the creature, or had they merely banished it, sending it back to the darkness from whence it came? Ben, his face pale and drawn, approached her. "We need to analyze the ritual," he said. "We need to understand how it worked, how we were able to send it back." Professor Davies nodded in agreement. "We can't afford to be complacent," he said. "We need to be prepared in case it ever returns." Zav, still recovering from the ordeal, sat quietly in a corner, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the creature had stood. He had seen its past, its agony, its burning desire for revenge. He knew that the darkness they had faced was just a fraction of the horrors that lurked beyond the veil of reality. In the days that followed, the team worked tirelessly, analyzing the remnants of the artifact, deciphering the ancient texts, and studying the effects of the ritual. They discovered that the creature was an ancient entity, a being of pure malevolence, imprisoned long ago by a powerful order of sorcerers. The artifact had been its prison, its cage, its tether to this reality. By destroying it, they had severed that tether, sending the creature back to the dimension from which it came. But they also learned that the creature's essence was scattered, not destroyed. It was possible, even likely, that it could reform, could find another way to return. Emily's skepticism had been shattered, replaced by a profound sense of unease. She had seen the darkness, had felt its cold, malignant touch. She knew that the world was not as orderly, as predictable as she had once believed. Xav, forever changed by his visions, felt a strange connection to the creature, a twisted empathy for its suffering. He knew that its rage, its desire for revenge, was not simply mindless savagery, but a reflection of its own torment. Ben and Professor Davies, their minds opened to the existence of the supernatural, dedicated themselves to studying the ancient rituals, seeking to understand the nature of the creatures that dwelled in the darkness. They knew that the world was filled with dangers they had never imagined, and they were determined to be ready. As the weeks passed, the lab was cleaned and repaired, the shattered equipment replaced. But the atmosphere had changed. A sense of unease, a constant awareness of the darkness beyond, lingered in the air. One evening, as Emily was working late, she noticed a faint, flickering shadow in the corner of her eye. She turned, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just a trick of the light, she told herself. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, persisted. She looked out the window at the dark, star-studded sky. A shiver ran down her spine. The darkness was vast, ancient, and filled with unknown terrors. And somewhere, out there, in the depths of that darkness, the creature waited, its essence slowly reforming, its hunger growing stronger.